Welcome back to another episode of Upon Request. Today we're here with Madeleine Macgillivray. Whoa, I'm gonna mess this up. Madeleine Macgillivray.
Macgillivray. Yeah, that
Macgillivray.
was pretty
God dang
good.
it.
That
Wow,
was
thank you so much for your support.
that was
It
great.
means the world.
Yeah.
um, we've got Madeleine on, and I think one of the things that we wanted to cover in today's episode is that coming from a background of organizing people and communities to take action on social justice issues for about a decade now, I've been a bit blown away by two pretty specific phenomena in our movement world. One is the amount of ego and ideologuing that happens, and two is like lack of clarity that many people have about how they channel their outrage. And I'm really excited to dig in with Madeleine here today about your perspective on what it means for the everyday person to take action on one of the greatest threats to all of our shared existence, climate change, and how it could be a tool for how people are showing up for other issues that they care about. And so we're going to dig in a little bit more on that later. But first, we're going to get the intro rolling because we've got the multi-hyphenate extraordinaire, Madeleine Macgillivray. I did it.
Yes. Yes.
Let's all celebrate. A round of applause for me. Just kidding. Madeleine's an expert on microplastic, hosts her own podcast, Superseed, as part of the Seeding Sovereignty organization, and does some really great education organizing via social media on a range of issues that are related to plastics. So Madeleine, welcome to Upon Request. And would you mind sharing a bit about yourself? Like, how would you want people to know who you are? Like, what are the most important things?
Ooh, yes. Okay. Well, thank you for that intro so far. It's I would say that you captured a good lot of it. I think that, everybody is extremely multifaceted, and there's like, I could go the route of I'm a highly creative person who is also, loves to play guitar and loves to paint and loves to communicate in ways that maybe go beyond words. But for the purposes of my commitment to climate justice and the movement and my work and this conversation, yeah, I'm a communicator. I love to humanize things. I love to bridge silos. I love to, I have a science background, as you touched on. I have a research background in microplastics pollution. So I love to draw those connections for folks between plastics and fossil fuels and public health and environmental justice, and basically like break down kind of, I would say, the gates of higher education, like, a lot of gate kept kind of information, like literally from just a perspective of like a scientific paper not being accessible to most people, and that's a whole other conversation. But yeah, like sort of advocating, communicating, humanizing, in a way that I would say is driven very much by like empathy and my natural zest, my natural animatedness. Like it's just part of my character. So yeah.
Nice. I've never had anyone describe themselves as like a feature of citrus. The zest of life.
Zesty. Yes. Yes.
Zesty.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's awesome. And I think that is super important, especially as we're in an age of like folks really trying to understand call in versus call out culture. Like, yes, we need everyone on board, but also like we need to be a little bit selective about who we define as everyone. Just because there are some like villains in this conversation too, and it's a really hard thing to navigate because you don't want people to feel like they can't be part of the solution because they're in a certain industry, but you also don't want like the
Yeah.
the Exxon CEOs trying to like peddle their own versions of solutions. So yeah,
Yeah.
thank you so much for sharing more about yourself, and I'm sure that there's so much that we didn't capture. um I wanted to kind of hear a little bit more about, and I think it would be really great for folks to hear about what I would describe, but maybe you would describe differently, as your strategy for this collectivist superhero concept.
Yes.
And I've heard you talk about this like obviously we know each other before this. We've had some great conversations, and I feel like um, I've heard you talk about this in a few different ways, and yeah, would just love to hear more about that, and then we can kind of dig in
Yeah.
a little bit more.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm so excited to talk about it. I like feel free to kind of chime in with like follow up because I might go for a bit, but I will try to structure it. I'm somebody who I am a like metaphorical over highlighter of everything, sort of so like everything's important, and so it helps for me to get a little bit of framing. But I will sort of just give the gist that I think listeners might benefit most from, with the amount of context that I think folks might benefit most from. So basically, you know, I think one of the things that I'm realizing would have been also helpful for me to have included in my like who am I is that I started in quote unquote climate, really just like activism when I was very young. I was like 9. I was like a child because my mom was at the time a practicing like basically pro bono nonprofit environmental lawyer, and she was a single mom at the time, so we really just like traveled around to the folks that she was helping and working with and offering her services for, mostly people who were very impacted by fossil fuel extraction, folks who are um, really on the front lines in their communities and like fighting for their survival. And I'm talking about people in Appalachia who were dealing with, coal mountaintop removal. I'm talking about indigenous communities in the Ecuadorian Amazon who were fighting Chevron. And I got to be like mentored by these superheroes, these people who did not have a choice and were just extremely targeted and harmed by huge fossil fuel corporations. And I got to know them, and I consider that to be a very unique experience, one that was really like, formed my perspective on the world. I think to have such a global understanding of like different crises around the globe when you're 9 that relate to climate is something that has really shaped my view of what it looks like to show up and like what the movement looks like. So I started this little project when I was 9 called Superheroes Needed. And my vision at the time was just like in my school. And I was like, we're all, it's just this vision that like, and I had this like book where I would draw superheroes and I like made up characters. I still have the book and it's awesome. It's like Earth Woman and like, it was a very innocent idea at the time that, we're actually all superheroes and that we all have our own unique skills to put towards the movement. But like a couple years ago, after working in many different sectors and nonprofit and like private sector and science and communications and fashion, I realized that this idea that I had when I was 9 is like such a great idea and actually should be really able to kind of come to fruition in the vision that I have now as someone who has learned a lot more and worked a lot more in climate. So last year, really 2 years ago, but last year is when I kind of went really committed to it. I was like, okay, what would Superheroes Needed look like? And what is the ethos? What is the mission? What is the message? And it is that after, basically almost now 20, no, that's, well, not quite 20, but yeah, like 15 to 17 years in like climate, and trying to figure out what my own powers are. I get asked a lot by people who are just really anxious about climate, don't really know what exactly to do, so to speak, and are feeling very stuck. And that I realized that the answer, well, of course, there's not one answer, but like my approach is that taking the fact that there are actually, according to the American Psychological Association, this is a really interesting statistic, 72% of Americans are wanting to do more in regards to climate and climate justice. Half of them don't know where to start. So there's a huge gap here. There's like a very wide, gap. between people's desire to act and then their actual action. And so there's all this kind of energy and anxiety swirling around that isn't being channeled. Many reasons for that. But essentially, superheroes needed is exists to empower this very climate anxious but very connection hungry kind of person, to really realize their superpowers. And the way that we do that is I spent many months developing a workshop. So right now it is a very intimate 2.5 hour long workshop whereby we dig really deep, because what I realized when people ask what can they do is like, I can give you a list of things. You can look it up. I mean, it's pretty accessible to know kind of the like check mark things that we can all do, right? And we can all, you know, try to compost, although that's a whole other conversation. We can try to, like these kind of daily behavioral things are like obviously very significant and important, but the real question people are actually asking is, who do I want to be and how can I actually go from doing to kind of being? And so that is a very existential question that I cannot answer for you. So if you want to ask me what can I do, I actually, with lots of love, will tell you that that's for you to dig deep and figure out how to go from kind of doing to being. So that's why I was like, this has to be a workshop where we're actually all together and we're all going through, like I made it's like a worksheet based thing. I'm like, we got to go kind of back to like pen and paper discussions. There's multiple different sort of modalities and things that actually occur like in the workshop itself. And I'm asking people to be really self inquiring, and that's a process that people in the workshop have described as like a group therapy session, because they do figure out a lot about themselves and then don't kind of have nowhere to go afterwards. Instead, it's like, okay, now I have this community. Who are the community? What is my community? And that's actually kind of step one, is like, who's in my community, not just physically, but so I actually have people fill out like an entire map, and they continue to do that over their, however long they want to. And so that's just a little bit about the workshop. But the vision is, longer term vision is really for superheroes needed to expand to more of a vibrant online community, more gamification included, and really coming from a place of joy. And the fact that, we're really superseding this idea that like it's a very Western idea that one superhero is like going to come and save us all. Like it's a very Marvel, like one superhero. And in fact, as like cringy as it sounds, you have to lean into the cringe. You are actually a superhero. Sorry, not sorry. And like you are needed. And so, really coming from a place of joy and like hyper kind of connection to one's community, the vision is to be sort of a ground zero for folks coming into climate.
Yeah. I would love to hear what the unhighlighted version is, because I feel like everything you just touched on was so important, and like, yeah, I didn't feel like it missed a beat in terms of the conversation. And interestingly enough, I remember, so we used to do this. We had like a steering committee of organizations back in Boston / Massachusetts that was, we mobilized around the People's Climate Mobilization, kind of part of the reason that I ended up at CMP as well. And we had this moment where we were like, what are we going to do? Another rally? Like, we just had the Trump elections. It's 2017. We can't keep on doing the same old and being like directed by these national organizations, like with a framework of like how and what is needed for our communities here. And so we had these like workshops where we like, not even with people in our community, with the organizers and the leaders of these organizations, to say like, what's your story of self? We can't start to build community if like we don't even know why we're showing up. And like, I think one of the examples, one of my mentors, Reverend Mariama, who serves on the climate justice team at the city of Boston and also runs her own church, of course, with the name Reverend Mariama. She would always mention this thing of like, she knew people for like 15 years working in like deep, dark despair of like climate challenges, and she didn't even know that they had siblings. Like, she would find out one day, like 15 years later, and like, dang, like we're just like aren't building community even in these movement spaces that are about building community. Like,
Yeah.
and so I think that this piece of the superheroes is like really important. But I think the even more important thing is redirecting people away from this like very global north Western mentality. And I think it's very unique to like US organizing as well, like US social justice movements, and very much so in recent years, to kind of move away or shun this idea of community, right? It's like it's very egotistical. It's super like you as soon as there becomes like a bright leader, you pour everything into that leader and like move them up the ladder way too fast. And it's like people can be great at one thing and does not mean that they're great at everything. And like I think actually knowing what your superhero power at a certain point um also helps you know what you're not good at too, and helps you stay away from things that suck energy away from you or are your kryptonite. I feel like we're using all the superhero analogies at this point.
We just have
But
to lean into it at this point.
just
Yeah.
lean into the cringe, as you say. Yeah.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah, I just like really appreciate that. And all of my follow-up questions that I had have been answered. So you nailed it on that regard.
Well,
So
thank you. And I appreciate that. And I want to just like touch on a couple of the things that you were just saying too, because I think if I can like remember them. But this idea of it is a very Western thing to focus all our energy on the one superhero. It's a very individualistic thing. And when I think about the maybe weaknesses or like pitfalls of sort of progressive politics, I think it is like very connected to a lack of hyper connection to hyper local community. And I think that like it just always, like every conversation I've had, because I for listeners as well, like I hosted another podcast called Superseed, which is literally about interviewing people who like have figured out, quote unquote, like their climate powers, and like how did you get there, what has your process been, like really grounding this kind of like what does a path look like. And it always comes back to community. And it's like it's kind of it's very, to me, the same thing as um you know, the fact that like organic wasn't a thing until the counter was invented, like the counterpart, the pesticide. Like organic is just organic. Sustainability is just your grandmother saving plastic bags because that's like, oh, she's being sustainable now. No. And I think it's the same as community. It's like, oh yeah, a big duh, because that's biodiversity. That's what strength looks like for any ecosystem. That's how we evolve and stay strong. And now sorry, that was a big we're all. Let me be a little more specific. A lot of like Western or US specific, people who have been isolated from their community because of certain cultures that we're in and certain like cultural just norms that are kind of, being pushed, like we're all kind of being pushed out of like the village and into our own, bubbles. We are coming back to like, yes, it actually is in the community. And I mean, really just, right, like sitting in the same like room as people who are also really anxious and talking about climate anxiety is a counter to climate anxiety. So yeah, that's what I have to add about that. But otherwise, I feel like we captured, the main gist and the main part of it. And I guess one last thought would be really highlighting the joy aspect, and knowing I'm coming from a place of knowing that is not accessible to a lot of people, but it is something that is really wonderful to strive for. If you're in a place where you have the ability to, as you're figuring out what kind of you want to start embodying towards climate justice, go for what brings you the most joy, because that is going to be the most sustainable. And we are not doing this for like 10 years. This is our life's work. This is our lives. We're building constantly and dreaming towards the world that we really yearn for. And so it's not like a short term, I'm going to whatever it may be, start reporting climate stories from a blog that I'm making about folks who are really impacted by XY pipeline. It is like that's a really longer term process. And so we are going to become burnt out if we do not very very proactively foster community from a place of joy.
Yeah. I completely resonate with that, and I think this oscillating on this point of like joy within the movement, I remember really profoundly being kind of disturbed by like the martyrdom within our movements. Like we've seen it with the youth climate organizers really just like breaking themselves to be part of this movement. But even in the racial justice movement, there was like a lot of, this person has been the victim of police violence. Like we can't be in any state other than grief. And like really just being like this movement imposed kind of mourning and grief process that I think is very unnatural, because people experience their reaction to the magnitude of these issues very differently. And I always had this inclination. I come from like the Caribbean. We danced at funerals. Like we celebrated life, we celebrated death. We like, it it was just so much more of a connection to this like deeper spirituality, that nothing is like the end and nothing is like quite necessarily the beginning. It's like all this like circular kind of experience. And so for me, I would like always have harnessed this like idea that there's joy in the struggle, and I like it's been a struggle to maintain that, especially with different movements kind of reiterating this point of this martyrdom. Like we have to suffer because others are suffering, and I think I'm seeing a lot more of it even now with what's happening in Palestine. Like it's definitely just like a heavy situation, and I'm not saying that folks shouldn't feel all of the feelings, but also like we are not the martyrs for that situation, and to like subject ourselves to that is a little bit kind of like centering ourselves within it, and so I feel like it's on us that have the freedom and the abundance and the privilege to also like harness like that joy, because there's been many generations of people that have harnessed joy within their own struggles, within their own like fights for liberation and under oppression. So
Mhm.
yeah, just to affirm that I really do like co-sign this
Mhm.
joy aspect as being really important. Yeah, before we kind of transition to some other topics, just want to open it up to the rest of the co-host, Eric and Kato. Eric, did you have a question, I think?
Yeah, I just wanted to ask about two things you mentioned actually already. One is how you were like you basically started your activism journey at 9 years old, which I feel like is not the norm for a lot of people, or maybe it is and they don't know it. And then the polar opposite was you were talking about how um, there's this barrier to scientific literacy that exists, which I think we could probably really dive into in terms of being, is that intentional? Is that unintentional? Those two extremes of being a 9-year-old and seeing what's wrong in the world and realizing that there's something to do about it versus being a, graduate educated person that like many of us are, but then getting to the point of like, this is too complicated to actually do anything about. How do you see, and maybe I'm projecting an answer, being a 9-year-old almost being a faster entry point into action as opposed to being a college educated, really smart person who has a lot of ideas but doesn't actually do anything?
Mm, what a question. That's a great question. And um, I would say that, you know, like the kind of the thing that I come back to that I want to highlight is that one of the main messages of superheroes needed, and one of my main points that I love to talk about, is just everybody is the expert of their own lived experience. And what is the definition of expert? And I think that the way that we use the word expert um, is could be a whole other conversation. I think that we have to balance the fact that we now, with the proliferation of like misinformation more than ever on social platforms, it is really important to fact check and have a working definition of expert. But I also think that there's a huge barrier to access for a lot of people to be able to call themselves an expert in a topic. And I think that there's a beautiful in between zone that we can be striving for a little bit more. So like for me to say that I'm an expert in microplastics is like a valid thing when we put it behind the fact that I went to an Ivy League institution. I have 2 degrees from Columbia, which is a whole other conversation. But then we look at the fact that I'm now at the end of that and saying, no, you really do not have to do that to be an expert. And in fact, you should embody your conviction of your lived experience as enough. It's very similar to what Mikkel was talking about earlier with the workshops that you were leading, with people owning their stories, and owning your story equals you're the expert of your story and what can you put forward. So as a 9-year-old, just kind of go back to that, like I was totally the expert of my experience at that point, because I was like, look, excuse me, I'm trying not to use expletives here. Actually, I'm like trying to figure out how to say it. Like, excuse me, I'm being severely not supported by my government and my local electeds right now. I'm 9 years old. This is like not what 9-year-olds should have to feel like they have to do. And I think a society in which like kids are shouting from the rooftops and suing their governments at ages 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15 is a severely broken one. I also will just say, like, when I was 15, I was part of a lawsuit. I actually literally, with a group of 4 other kids, we literally sued like the EPA, Lisa Jackson at the time, for there's a document in our country's sort of legal Rolodex called the public trust doctrine. It's not legally binding, but it basically says, okay, the government of this country should and has an obligation to, maintain the resources of its inhabitants. And we were like, you're not doing that. We didn't make it super far because it was the first time that ever happened. But after that case, 21 kids then came forward, and that's the case that started all the other, like now it's like Juliana versus US, Held versus, Montana, like all these kids are now in different states suing, the government for this on these same, well, very sort of different arguments, but like the same gist. And I think that having been a part of that was extremely formative for me and really empowered my voice. So I realize I'm not actually answering your question directly, but I am thinking out loud about it and sort of like chewing on it. And I think that the point that I would like to sort of get across in response to that question is like holding a balance of when we think about the concept of an expert. And then in terms of the idea of access to information, that's a whole other conversation. And the fact that I now, even though I went to, I have connections to these universities, if I don't use my email, right, or it expires, then I don't get to access the same papers that I was using to write my thesis or provide information to other people. And so it's a really broken system that currently science is not accessible to people financially. It's like, would I like to spend $30 purchasing access to this paper that I'm about to kind of explain to my audience, for example, on social media? Like I'll do this thing where I'll like take a paper and I'll like kind of break it down into like, this is how you read like a scientific paper. But I pick ones that are open access because it makes no sense for me to explain one that people can't then go and find themselves. I don't know. Anybody have any follow-up thoughts about that?
I do on the fact checking part, because that's unfortunately a major part of my life. I'm someone who works on the edge of security and technology and how that works with activism, and a big part of it is how to not get sued. So the opposite sort of endpoint of the court case that you've been on, where like you can use litigation in a way to like really get shit done, and we can swear here, it's okay.
Okay.
um, as opposed to
Yeah.
how courts have been used to shut down speech. And one of the other ways that can happen is actually through internal, like second victimization, where you fact check people's lived experience in a way, which can be really difficult and harmful. And there is a balance towards knowing people's lived experience is valid and true versus how to protect those people from major corporations, which will use anything that they can to shut down activism, but which is very, very difficult. And it's not something I can answer. It's something I work on, and I'm like, I don't have the right answer to this, but it is important, especially with the amount of misinformation out there. But again, are you going to fact check a 9-year-old just to say, like, if you're going to go and say that this 9-year-old isn't telling the truth, I don't think you're going to win that, because I bet the 9-year-old is actually, like, we know kids are pretty honest and they just say it like it is. And I do reflect a little bit on the simplicity often is just like the easiest way forward, or the best answer to a lot of things. Like specifically with sorry, go ahead.
No. I just interrupted you.
Well, no, I was just gonna say, like, with like getting to like the action point of it, like I imagine in your workshops, like if I think there's a tendency to overthink. Like I do this myself, to be like, how can I actually make a difference? And what that turns into is I think about it a lot, and then I end up staying here and like just read the news, which is important to be informed and educated. But again, I gets to that point of, we work with someone whose name is Akili, who talks often about, I had just heard him say this and I'm paraphrasing, that ideas are great, but lots of people have good ideas. And if you don't have action behind it, nothing really does change. So I guess I'm kind of going a long way around towards like this sort of workshop work you do. Would it be easier to do it with a 9-year-old maybe, where they'd be like, well, I guess this would be my first answer, as opposed to us that maybe overthink it a little bit?
That's a really interesting question. I think about working with younger kids, actually. I haven't yet worked with kids who are in that age range, but when I'm, as I expand Superheroes Needed, I'm giving it more to students who are in high school or college and really thinking critically about their paths, their next steps, feeling a lot of anxiety around that. And so I believe number one is that, young people for sure are where I currently am focusing my energy, even though the workshop is actually for anybody. You could be 100 years old and take it. But, right now in this kind of early stage where I'm looking for more folks to partner with, being able to give the workshop to more people, I'm really thinking about young people in that kind of like 18 to 23, whatever age range. And I think that when you were, I'm like also revisiting when you were asking the question initially about after like this process of me going through a higher education and then am I kind of stuck, or the irony of like feeling more stuck. I think what I would like to say about that, and what I would like to convey for people, is really goes back to the cyclical nature that Mikkel was talking about, in reference to life and death and just a general worldview. Like, I would like to offer a mindset shift. I would like to offer a mindset of a path being a winding, vibrant, beautiful thing that is in fact only going to get you closer to what you actually want to do if you continue on it. And I'm a perfect example of that. I think we all probably are great examples of that. And, I might be you really might see me as a preschool teacher in, 10 years. You really might see me as a criminal justice lawyer in 20 years. Like, I don't know, right? I'm blessed to have a worldview that includes me living a long time. And God willing, that happens to be my worldview. And so I recognize that that's not the same for a lot of people. And I would encourage just an openness to, if you don't go down the path with curiosity, really just from a place of like being genuinely curious. What is that going to be like? Then how are you going to find out and not be stuck? It really is about not being stuck. I have a mantra that is stick to it, but also don't get stuck. So like have conviction and move through your life with from a place of curiosity and from a place of like, yeah, I would say ambition, like from a humble place, but also don't get stuck in the small details in a way. Like don't kind of get stuck with like seeing the whole big picture as having to be looking like any certain type of thing, if that makes sense.
Nice. Yeah. You should definitely talk to Susie Hicks, the climate chick.
Oh yeah, love Susie Hicks, the climate chick. She's cool.
She's a past guest.
Oh, amazing. That's awesome.
Yeah, I had the same thought too. As you were saying all of that, I was like, oh, we talked about working with kids and, you know, climate anxiety.
Yeah.
It's so real.
Yeah.
Yep.
Pop out to SoCal, hang out with Kato, hang out with Susie Hicks and all the kids now.
Yeah, I heard she's in Cali right now.
Yeah, there. Yeah.
Oh, I need to reach out.
You should.
Yeah. A little upon request reunion out here, but I have some thoughts as you were talking to, and it's been so interesting to listen. I feel like a lot of thoughts have come up. I nanny a 9-year-old little boy outside of work. It's like really so joyous. I feel like kids view the world in a way where society has gotten to us at this point, at this age, but for kids not yet. And I wonder, I'm just thinking, so many thoughts are floating in my head, but I want to go a little bit to your podcast, because you said you have a podcast, right? And you interview, and correct me if I'm wrong, like young folks in the climate movement, right?
It's actually not specifically young folks. It's folks in so many different sectors, but the common denominator is climate justice.
Yeah, totally. I would love to hear, what have you taken away from your conversations that like has really resonated and has really kind of permeated through your thinking and reflections. I just think that talking to people is like talking about community. Like we get so much out of talking to each other, talking with each other, and being in community with so many folks. Yeah, I'm just wondering, like, what are some of the highlights of the conversations that you've had?
Yeah, that's a great question. And actually, so I, just for a little bit more context, I started the podcast January of last year. So we celebrated our 1 year, this January. And because of like bandwidth and the fact that it's actually a lot to produce a podcast, I don't have to tell you all, but for folks listening, if you're not, like the proliferation of podcasts is not correspondent or like reflective of the amount of effort. Like it's not like an super easy thing to just like, hey, I'm just going to start a podcast, boop, press record, go. If you want to do it thoughtfully and from a place of real passion, it's a whole thing. So we do one episode a month. And so I have interviewed, like at this point we've had 18 episodes, but a couple have been like part 1 and part 2. So I've interviewed probably like 14 people. And we created a like 1 year of Superseed sort of guide, or like a reflection with the advice that every guest, for people to like, it's like a really actually great starting point for, hey, I want to find my climate superpowers, and, read that guide. And it's just like little, kind of thesis, like headline from each guest. But to dictate it now, I think that the thing that like immediately comes up for me is a conversation with, and everybody gave incredible advice, but the one that just happens to be like bubbling up on the top of my head right now is a conversation with Dr. Marcus Erickson. He is a mentor of mine. He and his wife, Anna Cummins, co-founded the 5 Gyres Institute, which is actually in SoCal, or maybe not SoCal, but they're in, they were in Santa Monica. I think they've moved a little bit outside, but SoCal. So it's called the 5 Gyres Institute. It's a microplastics research and education organization. And they are kind of like, for me, the North Star, like main folks in, at least domestically, who are doing microplastics work. And Dr. Erickson was like, sustained pressure over time, small wins. And it really gets back to this idea of what's sustainable, not sustainable, like in a general sense, sustainable. What can I sustain over the course of my lifetime? And understanding that I think that for people who are not very close to or familiar with the process of actually creating change, it is something that they people kind of easily go to like, okay, well, how can I be most impactful? And to be most impactful, I've got to do the biggest thing. And the biggest thing is that I've got to sue the government, or the biggest thing is that I've got to create some kind of like a change and what I think that that's informed by many different things. I think it's informed, it can certainly by like Marvel movies, one superhero. I'm going to be this one superhero. Little teensy, doesn't have to be little teensy, but mostly tiny wins where a mom is concerned for the health of her child because XYZ, and then she goes to the school, and then she goes to the school board, and like it just starts with like, for not to get into like a cliche zone, but it does actually just start with one person really having something that they really freaking care about, and then they're passionate, they're vocal about it. And so I want to highlight the one of the things that I really come to with the pod is the importance of really not underestimating the small and hyperlocal actions and wins. And that is, it makes no sense for me to try to, if, for example, if we're thinking like from a policy lens, it makes no sense for me to like go into another community and just come in there and try to help. Of course, I would love to try to help them, but it's not going to be as effective as if I come in and listen to them first of all, in a big way, and spend a lot of time listening, and then literally just help them do whatever they want to do that they know best, because everybody knows their own hyper local, needs and cultures and families and neighbors the most. So literally, like, meet your neighbors, get to know your neighbors. These lateral connections are what builds resiliency. I mean, in my neighborhood, we had a flood last fall. It was really bad. We were so privileged to not be as impacted, but the whole basement flooded. And it was kind of the first time where, at least in Brooklyn, I was like, oh, yeah, right. The front lines are just coming closer to all of us, always, always. And let's not wait until we're, in a more dire situation. I'm so privileged in this instance. What can I do? And really, it was our block's group email listserv that was just this one little block where we have like a little listserv, and everybody's like, I have a vacuum, I have a this, I need a hose, and like just neighbors helping each other is in fact a place to start. So get to know your neighbors.
Oh, that is fantastic advice in the world right now, because I feel like, we've seen all these trends towards loneliness and isolation. And I mean, the solution is like get out and meet your neighbor, and actually, like, so much magic can happen from creating community. I feel like we're kept separate on purpose. Like, I've been living in SoCal for a couple years now, and seeing the design of this place is like, oh, okay, they want us to keep to ourselves. They want us to not be in community. There's no third spaces. It's just like, very designed for this insular life. And it's so funny because we had a fire alarm go off a couple of months ago, and like all of our neighbors, we were like all outside together, and we started talking, and we're like, did you guys notice that the hot water like takes a really long time? So we started organizing. We were like, we should unionize. So it's like when you start meeting folks, you start realizing you're like, oh my gosh, we have a lot more more in common than we realize. Like, folks that are just like have drastically different lives than you, and you're like, actually, wait, we are kind of alike, and there's so much power in that. And I feel like, first of all, I would love to see that highlights. We should add it to like the links, the highlights of sort of what the folks have said, or their parting advice from the conversations that you've had. But yeah, I think it's so important for us to remind ourselves that there's so much power in the collective. I love that this is like the focus of the conversation, because I think we're seeing, particularly right now with the genocide in Palestine, mass action is actually moving. Like, I think it's continued proof as we organize, particularly in really scary, violent spaces. And I say this I'm from Colombia, and Colombia, unfortunately, behind the Philippines, is the place where most environmental activists are murdered. And they're afraid of our governments are afraid of collective uprisings because of how powerful they are, because they really do move the dial, and because in community we are so much stronger when we're pushing for something. Yeah, and I would just like thank you for sharing those highlights. I think it's so cool and important. And I'm wondering, like, what do you do with your community, like, for joy? Because we're talking about like being in community, right, and doing really hard things and having really hard conversations. But then we also need to be in community and get to know each other, right? I always like try to start my meetings with a silly icebreaker, because it's like, you know, it's going to be really hard to start with business as usual. Like,
Yeah.
it's going to be really hard if we're not connected and have trust in each other. So like, what do you do with your community to build that trust so then you can do that hard work?
That's such a great question. And I would say, first of all, and by the way, thank you for sharing your anecdotes. I think that they're so powerful. And yeah, it's really, really important to remember the fatality of actually speaking up and how much power folks actually have. So thank you for sharing. And yes, I would say that my kind of first instinct answer to the question of how do I foster trust and joy in my community is actually celebrating the wins, no matter how small. If we don't, again, cliche zone, but like just true, like if we don't actually celebrate the win, we have to really like not revel, like, really extract that joy from that win, like really, really sort of milk it. And like, for example, just small example, but I'm a part of a coalition of organizations that is trying to currently get a piece of legislation passed in the state of New York that's a really would be a very significant piece of legislation. It is the first real extended producer responsibility bill that would require major corporations that produce lots of plastic, like Coca-Cola, to have their production over the next 12 years. Literally cut in 50% gradually. There's a whole specific plan. Also, it would require them to reduce the amount of toxins that are very disrupting to endocrine systems and the health of everybody, but primarily mothers, children, and those in communities of color and lower income communities that are really more impacted by, in particular, the incineration that happens. So there's a lot of exciting things from that bill. And every step of the way, because it's a really long process, legislation takes a while, and we have like a majority of co-sponsors, but like we have the corporations taking all these assembly members and senators out to like really fancy breakfasts. At the same time, we're trying to like lobby, and we've got our like peanut butter and jelly in our pocket. And we're like, it's just a very, and if we don't just be like, yes, we had a really successful day today, and be so proud of ourselves, then it's really easy to be like, oh yeah, this is totally not going to work. So really, really actually doing that. And then the other thing I would say is like really, really listening. I think that like zooming out from my community of like more grassroots organizing into just even my community of friends, like we do a lot of listening to each other. And I'm very lucky to have really, really symbiotic relationships with people who like, we just want each other to win. And like supporting that no matter what is a really healing and beautiful thing. So I actually, the word that I use, symbiotic, is also really important to think about. There's a concept coined by Glenn Albrecht about the symbiocene. And I actually co-hosted an event last Climate Week with Isaias Hernandez, Queer Brown Vegan, and Kalpana Arias of Nowadays on Earth and they're starting it, kind of blossoming it into a whole thing that we're going to keep collaborating on, but it's called the symbiocene. And it's this idea that it just goes back to community, the importance of biodiversity, and just this idea that like this movement is a place for people of every skill, every walk of life, every demographic, every worldview to actually work in symbiosis together. Like, why are we having a panel without eating delicious, yummy food and listening to a quartet, a string quartet? That's pretty cool. That was the event last year. It was really beautiful. Yeah, so that's all I have to say about that.
I thank you so much. I think the celebrating the wins is like, I want our audience to stick to that because we work in corporate campaigning and we're talking about like long-term campaigns against these like entrenched entities. If we don't celebrate along the way, we think we're losing because it's like the wins are just, they're hard to come, like not hard to come by, but we're talking about entrenched systems. They are hard to come by. I saw Eric nodding. It's like, they are. And how do we like keep ourselves motivated in the face of that? So really, really love that you highlighted that. I think it's, yeah, and also love the use of symbiosis. I always think of Finding Nemo and like, and clownfish and anemone. Yeah. And I think it's actually the first image that comes up for symbiosis too. Because I was like, wait, let me remind myself. And it's like the because I'm not a science, I'm not in science all the time. So for our non-science audience, it's just like the interaction between two different organisms living in close physical association. So how do we help each other out? I love that. How do we like work as an ecosystem? So wonderful. I feel like I'm going to be reflecting on a lot of really great stuff that you've just brought up for us.
Thank you, Kato.
Yeah. I think about Stargate SG-1. There's like this dude that has like a anyway.
Same. I don't know.
No, you have to explain.
You have to explain now. Yeah, sorry. Sure.
Okay. So Stargate SG-1 is this like space, like it was on the Sci-Fi Channel before they changed their name to SYFY and got bought over. And they used to make some really good original content. And Stargate SG-1 is basically, it's like the Earth planet like has these portals into different worlds, and they like jump through them, and then they end up on different planets, and they encounter like either like really good civilizations that are kind to them, or like very like defensive like civilizations. And yeah, there's a whole bunch of stuff, and there's probably like layers of bias and reaffirming some really messed up stereotypes that are in there. But one of the people that joins the team is like this alien like being who's like humanoid and has like a symbiotic relationship with this like kind of like leech that's inside his body, like this like alien leech thing that like also provides him like strength and like healing properties, and he provides it a home. Anyway, that's what I thought
Love
about.
that.
It was like straight up on some weird sci-fi stuff, but
find your alien leech.
yeah.
Like
wait, that's the Valentine's Day card.
Yeah, find your beach. No. Find your alien leech that lives inside of you.
Yeah. The person's like one of the best voice actors. Did voice acting for God of War as well, the video game, and I'll send some stuff after. You'll see who I'm talking about.
Educate us, Mikkel.
Yeah, I got you. But I really appreciated what y'all were sharing, because I think that I'm sure that folks that are listening also feel this, is that, from COVID, the Trump election, the rise of populism in the US, like I feel that has really shaped why so many people are struggling with their sense of apathy, their ability to be in community, their ability to take action. And I think what y'all are talking about is that actually there is a whole system that tries to counter our ability to show up and take action. And there's like a natural world around us that gives us so many examples of how we can show up. So I hope folks sit with that and kind of resonate with the reality of that we do have a lot of tools surrounding us. And I think as we kind of wrap this conversation, my closing question for you, Madeleine, and you can give us the outro, right, is what do you want to see more of in the world, and what do you want to be more in the world? It might be a really big question, but it's yours to own.
That's such a good one. I ask this of my guests, and
No way.
so the tables
Okay.
have turned. I ask people what their vision is, and I ask them to, they can give me whatever time scale they want to give. But like, yeah, I ask you like, what are your dreams? What is your vision in the work, in the field, of your community that you're in? And so it's a similar question. What do I want to be more of and see more of? I want to actually, honestly, like not even really thinking so like hard about it, but just like the first thing that comes to mind is I hope that more and more people are more and more free to express themselves freely, like without, of course, harming others. But I hope that we all kind of in our micro ways and just our worldview and our kind of values just are able to see see people as people and interact with like our neighbors as people as they are ourselves. I'm gonna get a little bit, I don't know, Buddhist about this, but just the ability for us to see ourselves as all one and as the universe and as impactful as that is. And that requires, I think, a level of self-actualization and authenticity and authentic expression of ourselves. I think I respect a lot of what I respect about like the Gen Z like approach in regards to, the email sign-offs or like these professional, right? Like these kind of stale professional expectations and sort of norms that we have are like what is serving us. And I think that like the kind of guise of like professional, the word is on the tip of my tongue, but I think like folks don't understand what I'm trying to say. And like, do we really have to put up a mask all the time when we're like emailing our coworker? Or instead, can we inquire a little bit more deeply and be able to really express ourselves a little bit more from a place of love? And so for me, that looks like continuously finding my powers and what I love to do, and being really, really grateful all the time for all of it. I think that just be here now is a really something that I'm constantly trying to do. And we all have very, very unique like things that we bring, right? So understanding that my combination of like the things that make me feel really good and that I like to do and that actually are really, really impactful is something for me to lean into. So continuously just like learning what that looks like. And that's going to change throughout my life. That was a little disjointed, but it was just free thinking, free thought. Like that was the most authentic expression of myself in that moment. So that's what you got.
That's what I asked for. I did
That's
ask
what you
for it. So
asked
that's
for.
perfect. Yeah, that was great.
Thank you.
Yeah. Well,
Thank
you
you
so
all
much.
so much.
Yeah.
No, thank you all so
no,
much.
thank you. No, thank you.
Seriously, thank you.